Well, hello again, everyone, and welcome back to another installment in this series of video presentations introducing some of the stories we'll be reading from now until the end of the semester. In this presentation, I want to begin talking about the last story of the semester, the Aleph. The Aleph is one of Borges' most popular stories. I think it's one of his best stories. It is also, like many of his other stories, complex, dense, complicated. As a result, I wanted to make a few video presentations introducing the story and pointing out some key elements in the hopes of increasing your appreciation for an understanding of what Borges is trying to do in this piece. Because I'm going to be making a wide range of references, I wanted to share my screen with you. So we'll do that now and begin talking about the Aleph. You may recall from previous presentations that the Aleph, or an Aleph, is a character in the Hebrew alphabet. It's in fact the first character in the Hebrew alphabet, and because all characters in the Hebrew alphabet are technically consonants, the Aleph is also technically a consonant. Now I emphasize technically because the Aleph is what is called a weak consonant. Most consonants in the Hebrew alphabet, indeed most consonants in all the languages with which I am familiar, are strong consonants. But the Aleph is called a weak consonant because it makes no sound in itself. So think about the way that consonants work. Generally, in English, as in most languages, consonants are cued to a particular sound or to a relatively circumscribed or limited range of sounds. So for instance, the D in English makes a D sound, the B makes a B sound, the C makes a K or a S sound, and so on and so forth. The Aleph, unlike these so-called strong consonants, does not make any sound in itself. Instead, it has to be paired with another consonant or a vowel in order to make a sound. The Aleph exists in Hebrew nonetheless as a representation of what is called a glottal stop. Now, you perhaps have never heard the term glottal stop before, but I assure you that you have produced glottal stops in your own ordinary daily speech. Glottal stops are so called because they involve what is termed the glottis. Now, the glottis is a part or a component of the larynx. It's a kind of a space between the vocal folds that can close and open. It closes to trap air and it opens to allow air to rush forth from the lungs and out the mouth. To get a better sense of what's going on here, let's do a little experiment. So let's pick a word. It doesn't really matter what the word is. Let's pick a word like eagle. And I want us to pronounce the word eagle together and to pay really close attention to what's going on in our larynx, in our vocal box, our vocal cords. What's happening? Uh, let's pronounce it together then. Eagle, eagle. Now, if you pronounce the word eagle and you pay really close attention, you'll notice that in order to initiate the word eagle, there are two steps. The second step is when you actually begin to produce the initial E sound, E. But before that can happen, something else has to happen. What is that something else? Eagle, eagle. Notice that in order to begin articulating the initial E sound in eagle, your throat closes, you trap air, and then your throat opens, the air rushes over your vocal cords, and you begin to articulate the E sound. Well, that first stage, that first step where you trap air, where your throat closes, that is a glottal stop. And what's happening is that the glottis, the space between the vocal cords, is shutting to keep the air from coming out. So, eagle, you trap the air, you close your glottis, then you open the glottis, air comes forth, it rushes over the vocal cords, and you begin to articulate the initial E sound. Yeah? This phenomenon applies not only in the case of the word eagle, in fact, it applies in the articulation of any sound. So pick another sound, a sound like a B sound in the word box or book. Notice what happens. Book, book. What happens? Well, first, the glottis closes, it traps air, and then it opens. Air rushes over the vocal cords and out the mouth. In the case of a B, I put my lips together, B, to make the sound. Now, this is important because the Aleph represents a glottal stop. It makes no sound in itself, but despite that, it is implicit in all possible sounds. So every time you begin to pronounce a word, you close the glottis and then open the glottis. That glottal stop, represented by the Aleph, is therefore implicit in every possible sonic, that is to say, sound articulation in a language. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means that although the Aleph doesn't stand for any particular sound. It is in a certain kind of way implicit in or diffused throughout all possible sounds. Put it another way, the Aleph does not make a particular sound. It is rather the condition of the possibility of making any sound at all. And this means, of course, that every sound you make implicitly invokes the Aleph. It is present in a kind of mute or understated way in every possible sound. Now, it seems to me there's a fairly obvious connection between this fact about the Aleph, this vocal phenomenon, and why Borges might have chosen to call his story the Aleph, but I'll leave you to work out the implications of that suggestion. So, the Aleph, first word in the Hebrew alphabet, implicit in the production of any sound at all. For these two reasons, within Jewish religion, Jewish culture, Jewish theology, and especially Jewish mysticism, the Aleph took on critical importance. And I want to talk about sort of two ways in which it was critically important. If you recall from previous presentations, specifically the presentation about death in the compass, you will perhaps recall that the standard Hebrew word for God, the generic term for God in Hebrew, is Elohim. I've written Elohim out here in Hebrew characters, El, O, Him. The first thing you'll notice, perhaps, is that the word Elohim begins with an Aleph. Now remember that Hebrew is written right to left rather than left to right, so the initial Aleph, or Aleph, is right here. You see these dots below it, you'll recall from the previous presentation, those represent vowels. So they're being paired with the Aleph to give us a sense of how it is that the opening of the glottal stop is to be articulated, what pitch it's supposed to be given. Yeah? So the Aleph, to review briefly, first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, implicit in the production of any sound whatsoever, and the first letter of the name of God in Hebrew. Now, if you're familiar at all with Arabic, and I'm sure you are at least to this extent, you probably know that the word for God in Arabic is Allah. And here I have it written out in Arabic. Yeah? Allah. Now, the word Allah in Arabic begins with an Aleph. An Aleph is just the Arabic letter that corresponds to the Aleph in Hebrew. Arabic and Hebrew are both Semitic languages. They belong to the same language family, and so they're comparable or analogous in many respects. So here we have the Aleph in Arabic. You can see that it is just this straight line. Corresponds to the Aleph in Hebrew and is the initial letter of the name of God in Arabic, Allah. Yeah. So in addition to being the first letter of the alphabet, also the Aleph is the first letter of the Arabic alphabet. In addition to being sort of implicit in Hebrew in the production of any sound at all, the Aleph in Arabic and the Aleph in Hebrew are also closely associated with the name of God, with the divine name. So this gives them a kind of importance that they might not have otherwise. Cool. In addition to all of this, I mentioned Jewish mysticism earlier. Jewish mysticism, you will recall, is termed Kabbalah. Kabbalah. And one of the characteristics, one of the defining features of Jewish mysticism is the mystical interpretation of words and even letters within the Hebrew alphabet. And the Aleph is no exception. For the Kabbalists, the letter Aleph connotes the unity and presence of God. And I want to give you a sense of why this connotation exists, and thereby a sense of how it is that sort of Kabbalistic or mystical interpretation of Hebrew letters might work in practice. So the suggestion of the Kabbalists is that the Aleph, which I've rewritten down here, is formed as a combination of two other Hebrew characters. Now, it's important to note that etymologically or historically speaking, this is almost certainly false. So we're not talking about the actual historical or etymological origin of the term, of the letter rather, Aleph. We're talking about a mystical interpretation given by the Kabbalists of this letter. According to the Kabbalists, in any event, the Aleph was formed or originated as a combination of the Yod in Hebrew and the Waw, or the Vav in modern Hebrew. Now the Yod, you can see here, kind of looks like an apostrophe. The Vav is just sort of a straight line with a sort of a half crossbeam jutting out to the left. The idea, according to the Kabbalists, is that the Aleph is a combination of a Vav, at a kind of sort of, I don't know, what, 45-degree angle, inclined a little bit, with what's called a lower yod protruding from the bottom, and what's called an upper yod protruding from the top. Now, the idea here, is that this symbol represents God's presence in the lower regions, so this lower yod, and in the upper regions. Yeah, so the Aleph, in a certain kind of way, links together, hooks together heaven and earth, and therefore symbolizes or indicates God's presence throughout the realm of creation, both in heaven and on earth. Yeah, and as a result of this, the Aleph in Kabbalah has a kind of a mystical or transcendent connotation because it hooks us to God, it hooks earth to heaven. Okay, so just a couple of things, historically speaking, about the Aleph. Think about them as you're reading the story. Think about what connections you might draw between the explanations given here and the content and theme of Borges' story. Very well. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to let us know. Otherwise, happy reading, and we'll be back soon with more presentations. Bye-bye.